In a discussion in 1975, Carolyn Heilbrunn and Catherine Stimson outlined two main approaches to feminist literary criticism. The first approach, compared to the Old Testament, is characterized by righteous anger and a focus on past sins and errors. The second approach, closer to the New Testament, is more disinterested and seeks imaginative solutions. Heilbrunn and Stimson argued that both approaches are necessary for feminists to navigate from the female servitude to the promised land of humanism. This dialogue reflects a broader debate within feminist criticism about the balance between ideological critique and imaginative exploration. Matthew Arnold also pondered the challenge of achieving disinterestedness in literary criticism, a concern echoed by Heilbrunn and Stimson. Drawing inspiration from feminist pioneers like Virginia Woolf, Mary Daly, Adrienne Rich, and Marguerite Duras, some feminist critics resisted theory and existing canons and judgments. For these critics, feminist criticism represented a form of resistance against monolithic systems and the patriarchal biases of traditional scholarship. Instead of adhering to predetermined parameters, feminist criticism embraced the authority of personal experience and rejected scientism in literary study. This emphasis on subjective experience allowed feminist criticism to offer unique insights and perspectives in literary analysis. Within feminist criticism, distinct modes. The first mode is ideological, focusing on feminist readings of texts to analyze representations of women, misconceptions about women in literature, and gender dynamics in semiotic systems. This mode is seen as a liberating intellectual endeavor aiming to critically examine literature and its implication for society. This approach, often referred to as feminist reading or feminist critique, is essentially an interpretive method among many others. It is characterized by its eclecticism and wide-ranging nature, making it difficult to establish theoretical coherence. However, feminist readings have been influential in literary criticism. Critics like Kolodny acknowledge that feminist readings offer alternative perspectives and interpretations of texts, recognize particular achievements of female authors, and decoding gender dynamics in literature. This playful pluralism of feminist critical theory is seen as consistent with the diverse perspectives within the larger women's movement. Kolodny's arguments, while compelling, do not fully persuade that feminist criticism should completely abandon the aspiration to establish a foundational conceptual framework. While interpretation and reinterpretation are indeed central to our critical task, we should not dismiss the possibility of theoretical consensus at this stage, especially if we aim to elucidate the writing process and its context for those unfamiliar with our field. All feminist criticism inherently challenges established conceptual structures, aligning with the broader tradition of revisionist literary criticism. Sandra Gilbert articulates the ambitious goal of feminist criticism to unveil and demystify the interconnectedness of textuality, sexuality, genre, gender, and cultural authority. However, despite this revisionary impulse, feminist critique often operates within existing. While feminist criticism shares affinities with other critical methodologies, its preoccupation with correcting, modifying, or attacking male-centric theories can hinder its progress in developing unique theoretical frameworks. By continually looking to androcentric models, even when supplemented with feminist perspectives, feminist criticism risks stagnation and dependency on a discourse that may not fully engage with its concerns. Some feminist critics have fallen into a pattern of revisionism that merely pays homage to male dominated theories rather than forging a new intellectual path. This trend is particularly pronounced in France, where neo feminist thought has been criticized for perpetuating the discourse of male theorists. It is imperative for feminist criticism to delineate its own theoretical ground centered on women's experiences and independent from male dominated traditions. While embracing a variety of intellectual tools, feminist criticism should prioritize questions arising from women's experiences and seek insights from women's studies and international feminist theory. It must cultivate its own subject matter, theoretical framework, and distinct voice, as advocated by Adriana Rich in her poem I Am in Danger, Sir. Virginia Woolf once remarked that a woman's writing is inherently feminine, but defining what exactly constitutes femininity in writing proves challenging. Helene Zigzou similarly argued that a feminine practice of writing cannot be theorized or encapsulated, yet it undeniably exists. Feminist criticism has shifted its focus from revising existing texts to a thorough exploration of literature by women. This shift has given rise to a new mode of feminist criticism called gynocritics. Gynocritics means women as writers delving into the history, styles, themes, genres, and structures of women's writing, as well as the psychology of female creativity and the evolution of a female literary tradition. The term gynocritics was coined to describe the specialized critical discourse which presents numerous theoretical opportunities. By prioritizing women's writing as its primary subject, gynocritics challenges traditional theoretical frameworks and prompts a re-evaluation of the fundamental questions at hand. This shift towards gynocentric feminist criticism was noted by academic critic Patricia Mayer Spacks, who observed a move away from androcentric perspectives towards a focus on women's writing. This transition spurred a wave of feminist literary history and criticism that sought to understand the distinctiveness of women's creative expression and how womanhood shapes it. Similar shifts have occurred in European feminist criticism, with French feminist theory emphasizing linguistic, Marxist, psychoanalytic, and deconstructionist approaches, and English feminist criticism incorporating these theories while maintaining a focus on textual interpretation. The concept of écriture féminine in French feminist criticism highlights the value of feminine expression, although it primarily represents a utopian ideal rather than an established literary practice. Nonetheless, this concept underscores the importance of analyzing difference in writing. The challenge of defining the unique difference of women's writing involves considering aspects such as style, genre, experience, and the reading process. Patricia Mayer Spacks characterizes this difference as a delicate divergency, highlighting the subtle and elusive nature of women's writing. Uncovering and understanding the history of women's writing requires meticulous research and reading, but gynocritics offers an opportunity to gain meaningful insights into women's relationship with literary culture. Currently, theories of women's writing rely on four models of difference: biological, linguistic, psychoanalytic, and cultural. Each model aims to define and distinguish the characteristics of women writers and their texts. Additionally, each model represents a specific approach within gynocentric feminist criticism, with its preferred text styles, and while these models have some overlap, they are generally sequential, with each building upon the previous one. Biological criticism represents an extreme viewpoint regarding gender difference in writing, emphasizing the influence of the body on text. It suggests that anatomy is inherently linked to textuality. However, this perspective is complex and can be problematic. While feminist criticism rejects the idea of literal biological inferiority, some theorists have accepted metaphorical implications of female biological difference in writing. For example, Gilbert and Guber in The Mad Woman in the Attic discuss women's writing in terms of metaphors of literary paternity, highlighting anxieties stemming from this perceived difference. Critics debate whether women generate text from the brain or other organs, challenging traditional notions of literary creation. Some radical feminist critics argue that women's writing originates from the body and advocate for redefining biological differentiations relation to women's unity. They view female biology not as a limitation but as a resource. Feminist criticism from a biological perspective emphasizes the body's importance as a source of imagery. For instance, Ostriker suggests that contemporary American women poets use anatomical imagery more openly than men, rejecting transcendence that denies the physical body. Similarly, Diggory explores how Whitman and Dickinson diverged in their use of physical nakedness symbol, reflecting different perspectives of the female body. Feminist criticism that adopts a biological perspective, aiming to write from the critic's body, often takes on an intimate and confessional tone, breaking professional taboos against self-revelation. This style, exemplified by Rachel Blau Duplessis' Washing Blood, can be innovative and powerful, offering insights into lived experiences like motherhood. Such criticism challenges traditional modes of writing and implicitly criticizes women critics who detach from their female bodies in their work. In contrast, more detached texts like Elizabeth Hardwick's Seduction and Betrayal or Susan Sontag's Illness as Metaphor may seem dry in comparison. However, there is a risk that feminist biocriticism becomes overly prescriptive, focusing too much on bodily experiences without providing deep critical insights. Some critics caution against placing too much emphasis on the body as the center of female identity, as it can reinforce harmful stereotypes and power imbalances between genders. While studying in women's writing is valuable, it is essential to recognize that factors beyond anatomy shape these depictions. The study of women's literary practices should focus on the body of their writing rather than reducing them to the writing of their bodies, considering linguistic, social, and literary influences on their expression. Linguistic and textual theories of women's writing explore whether men and women use language differently, and if so, whether these differences stem from biology, socialization, or culture. There is also interest in whether women can develop their own languages and how language influences gender perceptions. Feminist critics from America, France, and Britain have debated these issues extensively, with poets and writers critiquing what Adrienne Rich calls the oppressor's language. This language is criticized for being sexist and abstract, shaping perceptions of reality through male-centered categorizations. In France, feminist theorists focus on finding and using an appropriate female language, viewing language as a tool of male dominance. Some advocate for a revolutionary linguism, urging language that is not oppressive and that reconnects writing with the body. However, there is tension between those who want a language that works within academic discourse and those who seek to disrupt male-dominated structures. The challenge is to reinvent language outside of phallogocentric norms, establishing a discourse free from masculine meaning. The concept of women's language is not new to feminist criticism and has roots in folklore and myth, often depicting women's language as secretive. However, this notion reflects male fantasies about the enigmatic nature of femininity. Despite the rhetoric surrounding the development of women's language, the prospects for such a language remain uncertain, and linguistic, historical, and anthropological research offer limited insights into its feasibility. Throughout history, there have been various accounts and myths about women's languages, such as the report of Herodotus on the Amazons' linguistic abilities. Robert Graves romanticized the idea of a women's language existing in prehistoric matriarchal societies which went underground after the overthrow. Travelers in the past also reported on women's languages among indigenous peoples, although these accounts often exaggerated differences in linguistic structure. In certain cultures, women have developed private forms of communication to resist public silencing, such as speaking in tongues in ecstatic religions. However, such ritualized languages were often viewed with suspicion and led to persecution, as seen in the witch hunts. From a political perspective, the quest for women's language mirrors the language issue in decolonization where newly independent states must decide on their official language. Similarly, in feminist criticism, there is a tension between those who want to stay outside traditional academic institutions and those who seek to enter and transform them. Advocacy for women's language carries political and emotional weight, but it faces significant challenges. Unlike minority or colonized languages, there is no distinct mother tongue or genderlect spoken by women in society. Linguistic research suggests that men and women do not develop structurally different languages, though there are differences in speech patterns and language use influenced by social and cultural factors. Efforts to identify a feminine style in women's writing often overlook the complex interplay of literary choices, tradition, and context. Criticism should focus on women's access to language, addressing the ideological and cultural barriers that have limited women's expression. Virginia Woolf's assertion that all that we have ought to be expressed, mind and body, emphasizes the importance of expanding women's linguistic range rather than restricting it. Women's literature continues to grapple with the legacy of repressed language, highlighting the need to address these linguistic barriers in feminist theory. Psychoanalytic feminist criticism looks at how women's writing reflects their psychological makeup and how gender influences the creative process. It combines biological and linguistic models to understand the female psyche, shaped by the body, language development, and societal gender roles. Early Freudian views often reduced women's writing to bodily functions like urination, but later psychoanalytic criticism focused on concepts like penis envy, the castration complex, and the Oedipal phase. According to Lacanian psychoanalysis, language acquisition during the Oedipal phase is pivotal, with the acceptance of the phallus as a symbol of power leading to female displacement. In this framework, female identity is associated with lack, leading to a troubled relationship with language and culture. Feminist critics like Gilbert and Gueb revised traditional Oedipal models, portraying the woman writer as marginalized and struggling with gender identity. Women writers often express their challenges through themes of loneliness, alienation, and anxiety about patriarchal authority, which sets them apart from male counterparts. In Emphasis Added, Miller takes a different approach to the problem of negativity in psychoanalytic criticism. She expands Freud's view of female creativity, arguing that criticism of women's texts has often been unfair due to Freudian expectations. Freud suggested that women's unsatisfied dreams and desires are mainly erotic, shaping the plots of their fiction, while men's plots are driven by egoistic and ambitious fantasies in addition to erotic desires. Miller shows how women's plots have been judged based on this phallocentric model and how a gynocentric reveals similar egoistic and ambitious fantasies in women's writing. Some women's novels focus on romantic love, considered trivial by some serious women writers like George Eliot, while others explore fantasies of power outside of love constrained by social norms. Feminist literary criticism has explored alternatives to Freudian psychoanalysis, such as Jungian archetypes by Annis Pratt, Langian studies of the divided self by Barbara Rigney, and Ericksonian analysis of inner space by Anne Douglas. There has also been interest in a new feminist psychoanalysis that emphasizes the development of gender identities without revising Freud. One influential work in this regard is Nancy Chodorow's The Reproduction of Mothering, which examines the pre-Oedipal phase and the process of psychosexual differentiation. Chodorow suggests that attitudes toward the mother influence the development of gender identity, with boys defining themselves negatively in contrast to females, while girls build their identity positively through identification with the mother. Chodorow's work implies that shared parenting could change perceptions of sex differences and gender identity. In literary criticism, there is interest in the mother daughter relationship as a source of female creativity. Elizabeth Abel explores female friendship in contemporary women's novels using Chodorow's theory, highlighting the psychodynamics of female bonding. While psychoanalytically based models offer insightful readings of individual texts and similarities across cultures, they struggle to explain historical change, ethnic differences, and other contextual factors. To address these issues, a more flexible and comprehensive model of women's writing is needed, one that considers cultural, generic, and economic factors beyond psychoanalysis. Showalter considers women's literature as a distinct category not because of biology, but because it represents the literature of the colonized, as stated by Christian Roquefort in The Privilege of Consciousness. A theory rooted in women's culture offers a more comprehensive way to discuss the and difference of women's writing compared to the theories based on biology, linguistics, or psychoanalysis. This cultural theory incorporates ideas about women's bodies, language, and psyche, but interprets them within their social context. The ways women conceptualize their bodies, sexuality, and reproductive functions are closely linked to their cultural surroundings. The female psyche is shaped by cultural forces, and language use is influenced by cultural ideals. While there are important differences among women writers based on factors like class, race, nationality, and history, there exists a collective experience within women's culture that binds women writers together across time and space. Hypotheses of women's culture have been developed by anthropologists, sociologists, and historians to move away from masculine systems and values and to explore the primary and self-defined nature of female cultural experiences. Women's history seeks to illuminate women's experiences on their own terms, recognizing the significance of feminist consciousness of female culture within the broader cultural context shared by men and women. Female culture encompasses the roles, activities, tastes, and behaviors prescribed or considered appropriate for women, as well as those emerging from women's actual lives. It represents an assertion of equality and sisterhood with significant variations based on class and ethnicity. Some historians view the transition from women's sphere to women's culture as stages in an evolutionary political processes, while others see an ongoing negotiation between women's culture and the general culture. Women's culture is not seen as a subculture but as an integral part of the general culture. Women live within both the general culture and women's culture, transforming patriarchal restraints into complementary roles and asserting the importance of women's functions. Cultural anthropologists like Ordonez suggest that women constitute a muted group with cultural boundaries that overlap but are not entirely contained by the dominant male group. Understanding women's culture is essential for comprehending how women are perceived by the dominant group and how they perceive themselves and others. Androcentric models of history and culture are incomplete and inadequate for analyzing female experiences, as they often ignore or marginalize aspects of female experience. Ordner's model has implications for feminist literary theory, particularly regarding discussions of perception, silence, and women's participation in literary culture. In Ordner's view, the term muted indicates both linguistic and power-related challenges. Muted groups, though generating beliefs about social reality, lack control over the forms can be expressed, unlike dominant groups. Thus, women, if they speak at all, must do so within the structures of the dominant language and culture. Ordner suggests that women's beliefs often find expression through ritual and art, which can be understood by ethnographers willing to look beyond the dominant structures. Ordner presents a diagram illustrating the relationship between dominant and muted groups. Unlike the Victorian model of complementary spheres, Ordner's model features intersecting circles. The muted group space partially overlaps with the dominant group space, with a portion outside termed the wild zone. The wild zone represents aspects of female experience beyond the dominant boundaries. Women's consciousness in this zone remains imaginary to men, while women are aware of the male space due to legends and cultural narratives. For some feminist critics, the wild zone represents a space for genuinely women centered criticism, theory, and art, aiming to bring forth the symbolic weight of female consciousness and make the invisible visible. French feminist critics, for instance, view the wild zone as the theoretical foundation of women's difference and revolutionary language. American radical feminists romanticize the idea of women being closer to nature and imagine utopian enclaves in literature and real life. However, feminist critics must acknowledge that no writing or criticism exists entirely outside the dominance. Publications are subject to economic and political pressures. Women's writing often embodies both muted and dominant cultural heritages. Feminist criticism therefore involves understanding and navigating this complex heritage, which reflects upon critical history and tradition of women writers themselves. Women writers do not exist solely within or outside the male literary tradition, rather they inhabit both simultaneously, as Ellen Moers metaphorically describes them as undercurrents within the mainstream. Myra Jelen suggests that women's literary domain can be compared to a border rather than a separate country, offering open access to the sea of literature. Feminist criticism must navigate this border and examine women's writing in its dynamic historical and cultural relation to men's writing. Ordner's model also acknowledges other muted groups besides women, such as racial minorities. For instance, a Black American woman poet's literary identity is shaped by both the dominant white male tradition and muted women's and Black cultures. Gynocentric criticism aims to identify the cultural context of female literary identity and analyze the various forces influencing individual women writers. Moreover, traditional literary periodization based on men's writing often neglects women's contributions, resulting in gaps and distortions in accounts of literary history. Gynocentric criticism offers an alternative perspective, highlighting overlooked periods. For example, late 18th century women writers laid the groundwork for 19th century fiction, challenging perceptions of literary dead periods. Additionally, feminist critics have re-evaluated the significance of genres like the female Gothic and illuminated the feminizing influence of women's fiction on 19th century American culture. Understanding literary influence also requires re-evaluation, as women writers must contend with both maternal and paternal precursors, unlike male writers who often overlook female influences. We need to move beyond the simplistic notion that women writers merely imitate or revise their male predecessors. Instead of viewing women's place in literary tradition as a dichotomy of filling holes or creating lacunae, we should recognize the positive strength and solidarity within the female tradition. A cultural model of women's writing offers a richer understanding of women's fiction as containing both dominant and muted narratives akin to a palimpsest. This model suggests that feminist criticism can adopt interpretive strategies such as thick description, which involves understanding the cultural significance of women's writing by delving into its layers of meaning and social context. While no description can fully capture all the factors at play in a work of art, we can strive for completeness in our analysis, even if it